This is your Irish Diary, presenting the romance and reality of Irish life then and now. Áuric Éireann, or Irish Diary, is presented by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation of St. Paul. Professor John McKiernan of the College of St. Thomas in St. Paul is writer and narrator.
This is the face of a woman of sorrow, a woman made beautiful in tragedy. The face of a woman married to a man with an indomitable will. She and he were to play roles of epic size in Ireland's passion play in the 20th century. His rock-like will and her matchless strength of soul, these two, one of them, Lord Mayor of Cork, Terence MacSwiney, and she, the Lady Mayoress, both of these most harrowing roles on the world's stage. Their life came to its crisis at 5:40 a.m. on October 25th, 1920, when Lord Mayor MacSwiney died, a blessed release from 74 pain-twisted days without food. The expressions on these men show the seriousness of the moment, for though MacSwiney's death had been long expected, it was clear that what that death most promised was a stiffening of the Irish spirit in the struggle against England. Here is the doctor in charge of the inquest, and here is Lord Mayor MacSwiney's body, triumphant in death in Southwark Cathedral in London, openly guarded by a troop of Irish Republicans. The body is taken in a hearse to the railroad station to be shipped to Ireland, where the relatives expected to have a requiem mass in Dublin. Indeed, it was a tribute to England that the London funeral was less restricted than what she permitted in Ireland itself. Across the Blackfriars Bridge, the procession moved on its way to Euston Station, where one catches the train for the Irish boat. And here, for the first time, the proceedings suggested that British regulations were suddenly to become more severe. In the meantime, in this great procession, the pipers piped goodbye to Cork. There were two hearses, one carrying flowers, one the coffin, and a guard of Irish Republicans carrying the Republican flag, a tribute indeed either to British fair play or to their concern in front of the world at this death. In the meantime, the brothers mournfully carried their own brother's body to the station, to the hearse, to the station, and then transported not to Dublin as this procession might suggest, for this procession carries an empty coffin. The body was not permitted to go to Dublin. Instead, British regulations suddenly changed, reneged on the promise to the wife, and shipped the body on this special ship, the Rathmore, to Cork City, under heavy guard of auxiliaries who were there to be certain of what we don't know. When it arrived at Cork, the tug, when it arrived at Cove in Cork, the tug took the body to transport it to Cork City, where it was met by 6 military lorries, 2 armored cars, and troops, all to protect the dead body of a man of matchless will. His body lay in an open coffin in Cork City Hall. Terence MacSwiney dressed as Commandant of the Irish Republican Army. Alongside the body is the figure of his chaplain, Father Dominic, and the inscription on the shell of the coffin reads thus: Terence MacSwiney, Brigade Commander, Cork 1st Brigade, Irish Republican Army, Lord Mayor of Cork, member of Dáil Éireann for Mid-Cork, murdered by the foreigner in Brixton Prison, London, England, on October 25th, 1920, the 4th year of the Irish Republic, aged 40 years. God have mercy on his soul. The funeral in Cork was not quite the affair that it had been in London, since English regulations were not quite so liberal in Ireland. However, the British troops themselves were moved to salute the coffin as it passed. Planes circled overhead, and on the ground, armored cars and troops kept a watch on the populace. The body was carried to St. Finbarr's Cemetery, the final resting place of Irish Republican soldiers in Cork. You can barely glimpse the American flag in that picture. Now, what set in motion events that brought a man to such long drawn-out agony? Terence MacSwiney stirred the world 40-some years ago. In 1920, his long, protracted suffering, 74 days of hunger strike, caught the eye and the ear, the heart and the soul of the whole world, focused as nothing else could the attention of Europe and America on the struggle in Ireland for freedom. What could have brought a man, what events could have brought him to such a state of affairs? Well, it began in 1916 with the revolt in Dublin against British rule. And his position was summed up in the words of that proclamation that brought in, or that announced, the revolt. One sentence from there says, "We declare the right of the people of Ireland to the unfettered ownership and control of Irish destinies. We declare this to be sovereign and indefeasible. And the long usurpation of that right by a foreign people and a foreign government has not extinguished the right, nor can it ever be extinguished, except by the destruction of the Irish people." That sentence explains in a nutshell why MacSwiney fasted for 74 days in a London prison until he met his death, triumphant in the end, because it was through his death that the attention of the world was focused upon the Irish struggle for independence. The revolt of 1916 was, of course, suppressed within a week. British troops did their job quickly and efficiently, and within 1 week, the revolt was over. However, sporadic activity continued around the country during 1917 and 1918. Not perhaps enough to be a serious indication of the latter or later success of the Irish people. But a very significant thing occurred in December 1918. In December 1918, elections were held in Ireland, and they were held by the British government for elections, the regular elections to the British Parliament, which the Irish had been attending now for slightly over 100 years. December 1918, the election machinery is in the hands of the English. English troops guard the polls. English censors pass judgment upon what is to be distributed as an election notice. The newspapers are unable to defy English censorship, etc. Everything is in the hands of England with regard to the conduct of the elections. And in spite of that, the whole of the country gave a 70% majority vote to those representatives who pledged in advance that were they to be elected, they would refuse to go to London and they would set up, or continue at any rate, they would give faith to the Irish Republic, which had been proclaimed in arms 2.5 years before that. Now, this was a remarkable thing, because not once in the history of British politics has any party, had any party up to that time, ever won any election by a 70% majority. There had been no such vote in these islands, so that the December 1918 vote was a vote, no doubt stimulated by Woodrow Wilson's pledge of respect for the right of nations to choose their own government. At any rate, within a month of the elections, an independent Irish Parliament was convoked in Dublin, and the representatives, that is, such of them as who were not in British jails, such of them as were able to attend, passed this resolution: we, the elected representatives of the ancient Irish people, in national parliament assembled, do ratify and establish the Irish Republic, and pledge ourselves and our people to make this declaration effective by every means in our command. At this point, or shortly after this rather, the American Congress, or the House of Representatives at any rate, passed a resolution asking that at the peace conference, the claims of the Irish people, as shown by their, well, not free vote, but vote held under British jurisdiction, as shown by that vote, that those claims be respected. But Ireland was not given a hearing at the peace conference, because the power of veto, which operates now often to stall the United Nations machinery, operated there too, and it was not in the interests of England to present or allow to be presented to the peace conference the claims of the Irish people. Nonetheless, they had declared themselves, and there was only one policy that England opted for now, and that was a policy of schrecklichkeit, of terroristic warfare. These may be strong words, but I take them from the American Commission of Inquiry report. And this inquiry, this board of inquiry, consisted of bishops and other clergymen, the governors of 5 states, I think it was 12 senators, many other people from the House of Representatives, several mayors, a few college presidents, and people of this caliber. And this particular commission of inquiry judged that Britain was pursuing in Ireland a regime entirely of terror, of absolute and unlimited terror. Nothing had been seen like it before the Nazi depredations of our later time. Now, in the course of this Schrecklichkeit, of this terror campaign, the Lord Mayor of Cork, Thomas MacCurtain, was murdered by British rule, by British decision. This is his house. It was in this house that the police, who were armed by England and controlled by England, it was in this house that they burst one night and slew him in front of his wife and children. And here we have him lying in state. The extraordinary thing about this picture that should impress itself upon your minds is that really it is a duplicate, isn't it, of what we have seen with MacSwiney. So that this was something like a, what we might call a premonition, because MacSwiney succeeded MacCurtain as Lord Mayor. He succeeded MacCurtain to meet a like fate, but not a similar or identical one. That particular murder was judged by the coroner's jury. Now, the coroner's jury was called by the police, and only those people were admitted to it who were acceptable to the police authorities. But you must remember that the police were under English control, just as when the Germans in the last war overran a country, the police of that country were actually an arm of their power and their might. And so it was in Ireland. So that the Royal Irish Constabulary, who had conducted this murder, called together to follow the formalities, called together the coroner's jury. And this coroner's jury returned this verdict, that Lord Mayor Thomas MacCurtain was willfully murdered under circumstances of most callous brutality, and that the murder was organized and carried out by the Royal Constabulary, officially directed by the British government. Now that's an amazing and rather brave, I should think, under the circumstances, but an amazing verdict to come from the coroner's jury in 1920, placing the blame for MacCurtain's murder squarely upon the English government. Terence MacSwiney was elected as his successor, and that was his first step to his death. A few days after he had been elected to this position to succeed his friend MacCurtain, a new force landed in Ireland. That force, which was soon to be called the Black and Tans. We don't have to talk about them. Their name is synonymous all over the world with unprincipled terror. A few days after that, a few days after they landed, and still in the month of March, the month of this murder, the Lloyd George brought into the British Parliament for its second reading the partition bill, the bill that was to partition Ireland, since the campaign to suppress the people's democratically expressed preference for an independent republic. Since that campaign, despite its terror, was not succeeding, Lloyd George felt that by dividing the country, he might conquer. Divide et impera is indeed something that has been well established in history. Well, this then was the context of MacSwiney's death. And this it was that nerved him to that final agonizing end. A few months passed, during which time he seemed to have performed his mayoral duties quite well, too well, because the Irish people were giving their allegiance to their own people and to their own elected representatives. And in this way, as freely admitted by the editorials in the English newspapers of the time, in this way, the entire English administration of the country was tumbling down. People were simply ignoring it. So it was decided then that MacSwiney too had to go. This time, in August, MacSwiney was arrested. He wasn't shot in his bed or as he got up out of it, as MacCurtain had been, but he was simply arrested. And he protested immediately that the writ of the king did not run in Ireland, and he would participate in no way in acknowledging it. In other words, as far as he was concerned, this was an illegal arrest, and the only way in which he could protest was a time-honored one that goes back before the dawn of history, one that has been used in Ireland since before the time of Christ, in other countries, and even in the remote past in Asiatic countries whose civilizations appear to be older than ours. He adopted the time-honored defense then of shaming his captors by going on hunger strike. He was removed to London, where he could be kept under close guard. He entered that prison never to come out again alive. And this shot shows him at the time of his entry into that. You have seen his demise, you have seen his funeral train, you have seen his burial. Buried on October 31st, 1920. And the day after that, November 1st, in Dublin, Kevin Barry was hanged. And you have probably heard the ballad the 18-year-old medical student who suffered all kinds of indignities before he was hanged, but the next day, the day after this, he was hanged. And the next month, Cork City itself was burnt by the Black and Tans and the RIC auxiliaries. Now this is the context of MacSwiney's sacrifice, because that's all we can call it, a freely willed sacrificial offering on behalf of his country's freedom. What sort of person was he? We've established the context, but what was he like personally? Well, he was a member of a large family. This is his father and mother, his brothers and sisters. He was educated as the average child was. He was educated by the Christian Brothers in Cork. His father died while MacSwiney was still young enough so that it interrupted his education, and so that he had to go out and try his best to contribute to the support of that large family, so that he was 27 or 28 years old before he got his college degree. But it shows the persistence in the man. He became a technical instructor, and in his spare time he devoted his whole enthusiasm to the Gaelic League, to literary and dramatic societies. He wrote plays himself. He wrote 5 of them. 2 of them were in verse. He wrote poetry. He wrote articles. He found time to edit a weekly newspaper, which he founded himself. In other words, this was a man who lived fully. This was a man who had shown in the initial family experiences of assisting upon the death of his father and so on. This was a man who had shown loyalties, responsibilities, high principles, a sense of dependability and so on. And he was a man who was not fully taken up by his daily bread and butter routine. So far as we know from pupils who passed through his hands, he was a brilliant instructor. But this wasn't his whole life. He expressed himself in the manners in which I have told you, in literature and in theatrical activities. He wasn't a master writer or creator of literature, but he wrote a very expressive style. When in 1916 the revolt took place in Dublin, after it and before it, MacSwiney had already been in trouble because of his national sympathies. And several times he had been jailed before his marriage to Muriel Murphy, a very lovely and beautiful woman who married him in 1917 and in 1920 had to endure what few people have had to suffer. With this young child, this woman then had to go through the agony of waiting for her husband to die 74 days, day after day, as she visited his cell. This then is a brief outline of the man we call MacSwiney. But I should like to bring you closer to his soul by reading to you a few excerpts from his work, from his writings, particularly from this book, very remarkable, but a very profound book called Principles of Freedom. The essential MacSwiney is here, and I think we can see something of the sweetness of the man's soul, something of the resoluteness of it, something of its beauty. I shall read only here and there throughout it, but it's available to you in the public libraries. Principles of Freedom by Terence MacSwiney. For instance, he says this, and I think it's a tribute to his magnanimity. If Ireland were to win freedom by helping directly or indirectly to crush another people, she would earn the execration she has herself poured out on tyranny for ages. The suggestion having been made, you see, that Ireland should collaborate with anyone, regardless of that other person's outlook. And he says, No physical victory can compensate for spiritual surrender. This is the type of person we are dealing with. And while I read one or two more sentences, I'd like you to have a look at a death mask taken of MacSwiney as he lay dead in his coffin. And I think something of the quality of the man comes out in that. He says, for instance, with regard to England, and again, strange as it may seem, separation from England will alone make for final friendship with England. For no one is so foolish as to wish to be forever at war with England. It is unthinkable. And listen to this remarkable. Now the most beautiful motive for freedom is vindicated. Our liberty stands to benefit the enemy instead of injuring him. Now, I think a sentence like that could come only from a soul that was free of pettiness and free of vengeance, free of the hatred that is sometimes thrust upon the Irish when they say the Irish hate England for no reason at all. I think this is an answer to that. And then, as a further expression of that, he says, I do not say we must settle now all disputes such as capital, labor, and others. Neither kingdom, republic, nor commune can regenerate us. It is in the beautiful mind and a great ideal that we shall find the charter of our freedom. And as a final sentence from this noble soul, and as something I think that gives us an insight into the resolution which could bring him through such a difficult ordeal as to lie there, pain-racked for 74 days, dying by inches. And even when he lapsed into unconsciousness, the doctors found they could not force food through his teeth because in a reflex action from the unconscious will, he clenched his teeth. So long as he was held what he regarded as unjustly, so long would he adhere to his principles. And he said, let no man be afraid that those he loves may be tried in the fire, but let him, to the best of his strength, show them how to stand the ordeal, and then trust to the greatness of the truth and the virtue of a loyal nature to bring each one forth in triumph. Is this not indeed an insight into the mind and heart and soul of a noble creature whose nobility was matched, indeed, perhaps more than matched, in the heart of the woman whom he married, the woman who, only 2.5 years a bride, had to go through one of the most frightful ordeals of the 20th century in the cause of freedom.
If you would like a list of selected readings to add to your enjoyment, please send a self-addressed stamped envelope to Professor John McKiernan, College of St. Thomas, St. Paul, Minnesota. This program has been presented as a public service by the Patrick Butler Family Foundation and produced at KTCA-TV, Minneapolis, St. Paul.